Hello, everybody. Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 102nd episode of the Writ podcast. It's the summer mailbag episode, and because it is the height of summer, but there's not too much political news to talk about, I thought we'd answer some questions. So joining me to do that is Philippe J. Fournier of 338canada.com. Hey, Philippe, how you doing?
Good morning, Eric. It's good to see you again.
So we both solicited some questions from our social media, from our readers. I got some from the Substack chat. You had some, I think, on Twitter. So, they're going to run the gamut, federal, provincial politics. So if you're good, why don't we dive right in?
Let's do it. I have to say, though, I did not tag you when I asked questions from my followers because you asked me not to. So you don't know the questions that are coming. So that makes it more fun.
Yeah, and you don't know which ones I got for you. So,
Nope.
All right, this one I got from Ryan Viano, and I'm going to read the question here. So he says, one of the themes of the last two elections and current polls projections is how efficient the Liberal vote is. Have you or Philippe calculated the lowest theoretical vote the Liberals could receive and still win the most seats? If that extreme did happen, say the Liberals won the most seats but with less than 30% of the vote, do you think it could cause Conservatives to at least maybe start to think about electoral reform? Winning the popular vote 3 elections in a row and not winning the most seats would be pretty frustrating for a party, which I think is probably true. So we'll cut that into two. The second part about electoral reform, but that first part, I know that your model does produce a theoretical floor in terms of how much you can get and still potentially win the most seats. So for the Liberals, how low could that go?
The seat efficiency of the Liberals is spectacular, but that's a double-edged sword, right? At some point, if you win many seats by very small margins, you lose a few points, and then you lose many seats. And so it's possible that the Liberals could lose the popular vote by as much as 5 points and still win the most seats. Now, mind you, Eric, it would be a weak minority, but it would cause some legitimacy concern. I mean, I know the rules is you have to get the support of Parliament, the confidence of the Parliament. But if the Conservatives win the popular vote by 5 or 6 points and still come up short, we would have, I think, it would be harder to defend the current system that we have, the first past the post system that we have for sure.
I think you could imagine that the Liberals could potentially drop to under 30 and still win the most seats. And I think for that to happen, their numbers in Western Canada would have to really tank.
Yeah.
And they'd still have to be somewhere in the mid-30s in Quebec and Ontario. And you probably have the NDP doing pretty well. So I can imagine in that kind of scenario that you could have the Liberals winning 135 seats, something like that. And maybe the NDP is able to win enough seats to give a majority. So it could actually work out. But it would be... I'm not sure if they can go much further down than that. I don't think if you get to 27, 28%, that a Liberal minority is really plausible.
The regional numbers would have to flip on their heads. Like nothing that we see right now. The trends that we have seen in the last few years, yes, the Liberals don't do well where they really don't do well. But they're still getting double digits in Saskatchewan. They're still getting 15% of the vote in Alberta. They're not getting 5%. So it's possible. And to go back to the second part of the question, Eric, about proportional representation or at least electoral reform. Here's the thing: if you go to any kind of proportional representation, the Conservatives will never have a majority ever. And so they could be frustrated by the current system if they win the popular vote and lose the amount of seats. But it will be very hard for a Pierre Poilievre CPC party or in the future to have confidence of Parliament in any case. So I'm not sure if they will ever be convinced of that. That would be their way to go. What do you think?
Well, Aaron O'Toole was talking about that after he stepped aside, that maybe that's a way forward to have a proportional representation kind of system in place. And I mean, in that kind of scenario, you would expect some other parties maybe to pop up. And so maybe there would be more partners, potential partners for the Conservatives to work with. Maybe it would change the way that people approach politics so that it's not completely impossible to have a sort of grand coalition, between the Conservatives and the Liberals. But my gut tells me that if the Liberals win the most seats and lose the popular vote by, as you said, 3, 4, 5 points, I think the reaction for the Conservatives would not be to adopt PR, but to really try to maximize their own seat efficiency. and try to squeeze out those extra seats. Because as you say, no one's going to win a majority in PR. The last time anybody got a majority was Brian Mulroney at 50%, and that was in 1984. But that was when there wasn't a Bloc Québécois, there wasn't other parties. It was just a 3-party race. And in PR, it's not going to be a 3-party race. It's going to be like a 10-party race.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I don't think we'll have a conversion of the Conservatives to PR, even if the system defeats them again.
They would lose seats in PR. The Liberals would get more seats in Alberta. The Conservatives would get more seats in Quebec. It would be more balanced, but that's a whole different question that we could get into, and that's a separate podcast, I feel.
Yeah. Okay, so why don't you go with a federal question or two?
Okay, so Sammy on Twitter asked, what are the odds that the Liberals and NDP together have a combined majority in the next election? Right now, the numbers show that the NDP is hovering just above its 21 numbers, around 19-20%. The Liberals, instead of 33% right now, we see they're closer to 29, 31, 30. So, and in the case, if they do get together, and let's say you add those seats, it's like 172 or something, just above the threshold. Would it be possible for the Liberals and NDP to continue ruling together if they have just above the threshold?
I think so, and I think that is probably what would happen. If we have an outcome where the Liberals and the NDP equal majority, what's it going to be next time? It's going to be
172.
Yeah, 172.
Yeah.
If they are at 172, then suddenly, Elizabeth May holds the balance of power. But I think if the Liberals and the NDP do end up with a majority together, that probably means that the Liberals have done well enough that it wasn't such a humiliating defeat that Justin Trudeau resigns on election night. So I think that's very possible. And right now, with where the numbers are, I'm sure you actually have an actual calculation of it. For me, I'd say it's probably about 50-50 that the two parties could combine for a majority, maybe a little less than 50-50. But I don't know. What do you think are the odds are that the Liberals and the NDP could actually get a majority with the current kind of climate?
Thing is, I do not see the NDP winning more seats than last time, or maybe marginally more seats than last time. And the Liberals are in for some tough losses, unless, of course, there's a big turnaround and Justin Trudeau has a great campaign. But, if the next threshold is 172 and together they get 174, let's say, that means that everybody has to be there. Attendance will be a priority. And you would think that at some point Justin Trudeau himself would be okay. Maybe I do not have the legitimacy to go on. The precedent that we have here, Eric, is 2006. I mean, when you look back at that election, it's kind of amazing that Stephen Harper and the Conservatives took power because they had a very short minority government. And the NDP and the Bloc Québécois and Liberals together had more votes. It's just that we were at the end of a long Liberal reign. And of course, Paul Martin conceded. So Stephen Harper was able to take power. I think the Liberals didn't think he was going to stay for a whole decade. But I mean, if you're the Liberals and you barely make it with the NDP, do you just throw the towel and say, okay, we'll rebuild and we'll come back in a few elections? Or do you hang on to it? It depends if your goal is short term or long term.
Yeah, that's it. I got a comment on the Writ about that. About if that kind of scenario plays out, would the Liberals be better off to let Pierre Poilievre become the prime minister and lose a confidence vote, and so then be able to go back in with a bit more legitimacy, perhaps because they would have done the right thing of stepping down, accepting the will of the electorate, but then Poilievre can't win the confidence, so they have to come back to give stability, that kind of. But that's high risk because, as you said in 2006. I think there was the expectation that Harper would maybe defeat himself and then the Liberals would be able to come back very shortly. But it's a high-risk thing to give up power once you have it.
And Stéphane Dion happened. So, you never know, right? Those delegated conventions.
Do you got a quick second one maybe before we come back to mine?
Yes, I have a quick one from Simon. Eric, Philippe, federal elections this fall? Interrogation point. Question mark.
No.
Nope. You say no unequivocally?
No. No election coming.
I agree. I think it's going to be, I mean, it comes down to 24 or 25. I don't see it coming in the short term. There's no advantage neither for the NDP or for the Liberals. And together, they're holding on to power. So, no, Simon, neither Eric and I think there will be an election this fall.
What odds would you give, percentages, that it is going to be in October 2025? Right now, my gut is like 80-20 that it'll be on time.
Really? 80% that our minority government goes the full distance, huh?
I just don't see why either of them would pull the plug a year early. I just don't understand what would motivate them to do that.
What motivated Justin Trudeau to go in August 21?
The polls are good. He was leading by like 10 points in the summer.
Yeah.
He's not leading by 10 points now.
No, he's not. But let's say inflation goes down a little bit, and the economy still goes well. There's a lot of ifs, but it's just that precedent says that minority governments don't last that long. What's the longest? His Harper in 2006 to 2008, was that the longest minority? I think it was.
Well, maybe recently. I think 2008, 2011 might have been a little bit.
Yeah, it's true.
2006, 2008 was, yeah.
It was
I think
January,
28.
Yeah.
Yeah, but actually, like there were some in the 20s that did last the whole time because the Liberals had the support of the Progressives. And so like I find maybe the precedent here because the Liberals have the support of the NDP. It can last the whole thing because it's not the same kind of brinksmanship minority that we usually have, right? But yeah, I don't know. I would be so afraid to call an early election after what happened last time.
That's
right?
true. That's true. It's just that I'm a fan of elections. I think 25 is too far away. I want elections sooner.
Okay. All right. Well, then if you're listening, PMO, give us something to do. Okay,
Please.
So I'm going to ask this question. It was not a question, more of a comment from Benita O'Daker, who is not very happy that some of the ridings are disappearing. So she asked us to discuss the Don Valley East riding disappearing and what she called the flawed electoral boundaries process. So the beef that I've heard, and you hear every 10 years, is that, so the process is the commissioners who redraw the boundaries, they come out with a proposal. The proposal goes to public hearings. They then take the feedback they got from the public hearings, come out with a final proposal, and then that goes to the MPs who can make their final objections. So there's not a second chance for people to be upset about the final proposal. So we have seen in the commissioners who are doing the redistricting big changes between the proposal and the final proposal. So if you don't like the final proposal, you don't really have the same opportunity to raise some objections. So some people have thought that that was not the proper way to go. For me, I got to say, I don't know what else you do. You can't just keep going back to the public for, well, what about this? Okay. Well, what about this? And like eventually you have to make a decision. So I don't think the process is perfect, but I think at some point you do need to go ahead and make a decision. You can't just keep going back to the public to see what they think about something.
You'll never please everybody. It's impossible. I guess you could go see your MP and express your displeasure. But yeah, okay, that's yeah. So I followed your, of course, on the Writ.ca. I followed your many articles on the redistricting so far. What are your general comments so far? I mean, it seems that I read your articles. It seems that there are some gains and losses by each party in regions, but overall, so far, it looks pretty balanced. Am I wrong about this?
Well, I haven't done Ontario yet. I'm taking a look at BC right now, and there are a few changes as well there. It does seem like the Conservatives are doing pretty well so far, but I'm not sure. I haven't done Ontario, so honestly, I don't know. But for example, in Alberta, with the extra seats that are being added there, they're going to come out ahead there. There's a few changes that are being that are going to happen in Atlantic Canada. It's probably going to help the Conservatives a little bit. I think overall, it's not going to be a huge advantage for one party or the other, but at the margins, there's going to be a few gains, I think, for the Conservatives that are going to increase their vote efficiency a little bit, because the fact that they can win probably the 3 new seats or net 3 new seats in Alberta, and there's 3 being added, that's going to help them out there. So I do think there will be some adjustments, but I do want to hear what you think about the aspect that Bonita asked about writings disappearing, because in Quebec there's a lot of controversy over the disappearance of the Avignon, Lamitis, Matapedia, Matan, some variation of those four words disappearing because the Gaspé is losing a population, and so they create a writing instead in the Laurentian. So, like, what do you think? What's your view of that? Like, at some writings more or less disappearing.
I take a very cold and numbered view on it. I have to say, I understand their concerns. I mean, I actually met with Christina, last name is Quinty,
Michaud.
but Michaud, merci, the MP from that riding in the Gaspésie, and we discussed this. And I understand where she's coming from. She's losing her riding, and they're changing the borders, and the communities will not be the same. But the Gaspésie was overrepresented. I mean, you can't keep those ridings that are underpopulated if you want to have some kind of a fair distribution. Every riding has to be roughly the same size, with some exceptions, obviously. But on the provincial side in Quebec, the Gaspésie has two ridings, so it's Gaspé and Bonaventure. And during the last Quebec election, I raised this, and I had a lot of pushback. It says, Gaspé and Bonaventure, if you merge them right together, the new riding of Gaspé-Bonaventure, it would still be less populated than 24 Montreal ridings. That's insane to me. I know, so if you want to keep it fair, our system is already flawed as it is. You have to keep the same amount of population in each riding, roughly. So I understand where they're coming from, but at some point, the population is moving, so it happens.
Well, as a native Gaspésian, I'll say that we are worth more than Montrealers, so I think it's okay. But it is a zero-sum game, right? Because if you don't take away a riding from Toronto, which is what happened in Ontario, you don't take a riding away from the Gaspé, you don't give a riding to someone else, right?
Yeah.
So in Ontario, the number of ridings that were added, I don't think is very many. I can't recall exactly, but it's not, the number of ridings is not increasing a lot. So with all the population moving out into the GTA, into areas like that, if they didn't take a riding away from Toronto, then the people who live in the GTA don't get that extra riding. So you can't please everybody. And it's unfortunate it has to be that way, but I mean, we do have to have moderately equal ridings in terms of population.
Of course. And again, if I were an MP and my riding was just disappearing like this, I would be mad. I understand. I don't saying they're wrong, but you have to look at it coldly and say we have to have ridings that are of a roughly equal size. Otherwise, what are we doing, right? I know there are some exceptions, and for I read many people, especially in Western Canada, strangely, that said, "Oh, Quebec was supposed to lose a riding, and then they didn't." Okay, there are 6 provinces that have fewer people per riding than Quebec. So Quebec is actually right in the middle where it should be in population per riding. The fact that Ontario only gained 1 seat, I thought was outrageous. Because and Alberta gains 3 seats, but they were underrepresented. So I think the commission, again, as you said, their process is maybe flawed, but it's pretty good still. And it's a complicated process that you can't please everybody.
Right, like the famous quote about democracy, the worst system except for all the other ones.
That's right.
All right, so and also just to mention, you mentioned Christina Michaud, the Bloc Québécois MP. She should run in the new Gaspésie Les Îles Listegouche riding because she can win there because it's going to be a lot better for the Bloc. Okay, what do you got?
What do I got? Okay, I have. Oh yeah, are we moving to? I have one. Christopher. To what extent do you think your work, which is excellent, by the way, thank you, Christopher, influences the behavior of politicians and political parties? Do you think that your work, Eric and Philippe, influence politicians and political parties? What do you think about that?
I think indirectly. I don't think that we are movers, like market movers or anything like that. But, we do interpret the polls, and a lot of people do follow our interpretations, and sometimes, it contributes to setting the narrative rather than individual polls. So I do think there is some effect there, but I think the way that both of us, and particularly you more recently, have had a direct impact on how politicians act is that they freak out during election campaigns when they're not winning in a riding. I think we've both had that. I don't do public riding projections anymore. I don't put out who's going to win in one riding or another. But when I did, I'd get people who were saying, that you have me losing here, or you had me losing and I won, or that kind of thing. And so I've heard it from Dan Arnold, who's been on the podcast before. He said how he would sometimes get messages from MPs saying, I'm losing on 338. Like, you need to send me more resources or whatever like that. So I think it does have an impact.
I would say an impact, yes, but limited impact, because if you're a political party, a serious political party, and you don't have internal polling, then you are not a serious political party. If you rely only on my numbers or AX numbers, then you are not serious. Yeah, it's a compliment. We show the trends, we show the general trends, and most of them have been good. I received a lot of heat. I missed an Ottawa riding. In the Ontario election. I had a close race, a close three-way race, in the NDP in third place. And actually, the odds of winning for the NDP were 1.4%, and the NDP won. And I received a lot of hate messages from that one. I said, well, that's the thing. There's 124 ridings, and 1% is not 0%. So, sorry, but if that happened all the time, it would be a problem. But it's a rarity. Do we influence? I don't think we do, and we are much. But again, if you're a political party, you should do your internal polling. And if you don't, you're not serious. So,
I do think that the polls overall, the public polling, does have an impact in terms of the narrative setting and how parties react, right? So I agree with you that they do their own numbers and will usually rely on that to make big decisions. But in terms of their behavior, the kind of questions they end up having to answer, the kind of positions they sometimes have to take, I think is impacted by the polls and the general narrative of the polls of, you're losing, you're winning, things are going well. Yeah. And because of our work, we have an influence on that. But the polls themselves are what is having the bigger influence, the bigger impact than what we say about them, right? So
it's information. It's information. We should. Yeah. So those who say that we should cut the polls during an election, why don't we cut the news? Why don't we cut Facebook? Yeah, just shut it. No radio ads. No nothing. No ads. We should not inform people at all of the state of the race. That means it would be a fair election. Come on, man.
Yeah. So. Okay, so I have one that's not really a federal one. We can move to some provincial ones after this, but this is more of a bigger question. So this was from Ryan Leslie, and this was on Twitter. And he says there seems to be two approaches to speaking about politics: a more academic, data-driven approach that tells macro narratives. Alternatively, there is a more journalistic, insider accounts that speaks about politics as a story. And he asks, which do you think is more important? What do you think?
Why don't you go first? I have to think about this.
Yeah. Well, I guess it means what it means in terms of what's more important. Because in terms of what's more important, I would think that the journalistic approach is more important because more people read it and it has a bigger impact on public policy. It wasn't data-driven stuff that has made the Chinese foreign interference story a big one, right? Because I've written about it a bit, saying how there's not a lot of data-driven evidence that it had a huge influence on the election, but it doesn't matter, right? The story of it is far more important. So in terms of its impact, I would say that the other approach, the more journalistic people approach, has more importance. But in terms of which one is more valuable, I think neither of them is more valuable, and they're each less valuable if they're not combined. That you need to have you need to have the evidence, the data to back up the stories, I think. And if you only have one or the other, you're missing a big chunk of things.
I generally agree with this. Of course, you cannot replace the good old journalism looking for stories because people that do data will not go on the field as much, and so
we don't like we don't like the sun. So.
We don't like people. But I would approach it if we think about elections. Right now, we're in a period, Eric, where in general, the turnout rate goes down everywhere in the Western world. There's about a third of the population in Canada that did not vote the last election, and same thing with Quebec and even Alberta. It was a compelling election. Almost a third of Albertans did not vote. In Ontario, it was abysmal. It was 43% turnout,
Yeah.
I believe it was, right? Um, so whatever gets people interested in politics and policy and following the news and trying to be more informed for me works. There are some people, I include myself. Yes, I'm a follower of politics, but the numbers and the demographics. This is what is my passion. And if I didn't have that, I would be much less interested. I would play more video games. And I know some people, you have to interest people whichever way you can find. So there, I would answer. I know it's not exactly the question that was asked by your reader, but my answer is whichever way gets people more interested in public policy and public governance, I think is a good outcome.
Yeah, the way I kind of think about it is that the horse race kind of stuff coverage that you and I do gets a bit of a bad rap. But to me, if you're interested in the horse race, you'll be a lot more interested in what the horses are doing. And
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
I think it's an entry. It's a gateway drug into politics.
I would not say that, but sure. That's good.
So yeah. Okay. So let's move to some provincial stuff. I don't have as many provincial questions, so why don't you go first?
All right, I have three. Pretty good ones from my love. If I be Quebec centric here for a moment, John asked, "Will the CAQ be beaten one day?"
Yes, of course. Eventually.
Eventually, yes. The thing is, if I have a follow up to his question, is how? Okay, how can you picture a CAQ defeat?
That's interesting. I mean, there's a number of avenues that could happen. It's hard to see right now how it would happen because none of the other parties seem very well poised to take over because they're all just pulling apart little pieces of the CAQ, not an entire part of it. We've seen the PQ go up in the polls recently, but I'm not exactly seeing the potential for the PQ to be into the high 30s at the expense of the CAQ. And it has to almost be at the expense of the CAQ because they need to take that vote away to win seats in the regions because they're not doing that. But in terms of like how it actually happens, I mean, there could always just be that Legault resigns and they name someone else who everybody dislikes or takes over as leader. But I think the wear and tear of government is eventually going to take down the party if it's not anything specific. And, maybe the first post CAQ government is a unwieldy minority government with 4 or 5 parties with seats in the National Assembly. And it's whatever comes out of that gets to set the course for the next kind of government. But it is a little hard to see right now where the CAQ's weakness is in terms of losing enough seats that they end up losing the government.
John, yes, the answer is yes. The CAQ will be beaten one day. By the way, it's yes. Okay, we will not become a one-party state in Quebec. The how, as you said, Eric, is more interesting, and I think the CAQ could become a dynasty that's similar to the PC in Ontario or the former PC in Alberta. Maybe not 4 decades. Let's be serious. But it could become a dynasty where it's going to be really hard to dislodge that centrist, nationalistic, team. As you said, the Parti Québécois has gained a few points since the last election. And from the numbers that we have seen, it's basically former CAQ voters who tend to be more sovereigntist. But there's a limited number of those voters. The PQ is not merging with the Québec Solidaire. These two parties hate each other. That's not happening. The Liberals are not strong, but are still not going anywhere. And the Duhem party, it's still 10-ish% of the population, and those voters tend to be volatile. So you can't really count on them to build a coalition. I think Legault at some point will call it quits, and it will really depend on who succeeds him. And then you could see this coalition blow up, but it could take a while. You and I maybe it's going to be in the 30s. So we'll see in the 2030s.
2030s, yeah. But you mentioned Quebec Solidaire and the PQ. Like that, to me, is part of the issue, is that a lot of the gains that the Parti Québécois has made has been in Quebec City.
Yeah.
In part because of the Troisième lien, and people are upset about that. But for the PQ to keep growing at the expense of the CQ, that doesn't mean that they end up wooing Montrealers who are supporting QS. So it doesn't really work very well. That's what I mean. All of these, if you imagine like the CQ is in the center, you have all the other parties around it, but they don't overlap enough. The Venn diagram is just the CQ in the middle, and then each of the parties kind of around it. So there's not enough shared. It's just hard to imagine how any party right now is able to pick up 20 points, which is more or less what they need.
Yeah.
Because where is it coming from? There's not 20 points on one side of the spectrum that is all there for the taking. It's just really tough to see. And I mean, eventually it'll happen, and it'll be very obvious when it happens. But right now, it's hard to see.
We'll play the tape. I can say that it won't be Québec Solidaire. Québec Solidaire clearly has hit a plateau. They could win.
They hit the plateau very, very literally.
Oh, there you go! Boom! There you go. I did it.
Do you have another Quebec one?
I do, but I have an Ontario one after, right?
Okay.
Pierre-Yves asks en français, if you had to bet in your lifetime, do you think that Quebec will become an independent country?
In our lifetime. So we're both assuming that we'll live for another 40, 50 years at least.
Let's say 40.
Yeah. I'm going to say, if I would bet, I'd say no.
Yeah.
I think the window closed. The younger generations we're seeing do not support sovereignty in the same numbers. And I think that what's in one way killing sovereignty the most, and I know that the recent polls still show, high 30s, like it hasn't changed all that much, is that the approach that Legault has taken is effectively giving Quebec a lot of sovereignty. It's like the only thing that Quebec doesn't have is a flag of the United Nations and a team at the Olympics at this stage. So it has almost removed the necessity for it, because the CQ has pretty successfully used this jurisdiction, and the federal government, for the most part, doesn't want to get involved. So I have trouble seeing the catalyst that gets it to sovereignty, because it was Meech Lake and Charlottetown that was the catalyst for the 95 referendum to be so close. But I don't know what would happen that would propel sovereignty to 55, 60%, which is probably where it would need to be to have a realistic kind of path to electing a government that's sovereignist and then a referendum that wins.
Yeah. The odds are not zero, obviously, but again, if I had to bet, like 50-50 odds, I would vote no either. It's not that I do or don't want it to happen. Obviously, that's not what I'm in. But the demographics is not there. The numbers, it's still strong. And I remember my late father once we talked politics, and he said something that was kind of funny. He said the problem in Quebec is that there are too many sovereigntists. And then he would pause for a second, or too few. If sovereignty was in the teens or the low 20s, we would never hear about it again. And if there were more of them, we would have become independent already and it would be done. But there's just that, mid to high 30s, enough to win support and to cause a ruckus, but not enough to win. And I've heard also many people mention, if let's say we go back in 10, 12, 15 years, we go back into a referendum campaign, the example of Brexit will come back. And it's going to, cause a little pause. And the analogy of Brexit with Quebec, well, I guess Montreal would be Scotland. And so you would have internal strife here in Quebec about this. So it's a fascinating subject to dive into. It's obviously it's not the subject of the hour of the decade even. But Pierre asked the question. I don't think it's going to happen, but the odds are not zero. A scandal could make it happen. And for those who are saying it, I read that on Twitter from PQ supporters that a Pierre Poilievre government in Ottawa would boost sovereignty. it's defensible as an argument, but I remember the exact same argument when Stephen Harper won in '06. That's, with a conservative, a Western guy taking over in Ottawa, it's going to boost sovereignty. And you know what? It did the exact opposite. It didn't. There are many factors, of course. It's not unidimensional. But be careful in your analysis because precedent says it makes no sense.
The one difference I would point out between Harper and Poilievre is that Harper was explicitly trying to woo Quebec nationalists, whereas Poilievre is explicitly more or less saying that he's going to treat Quebec like any other province. He has not come forward with a specific deal for Quebec like O'Toole did, for example. There is that possibility. But, they're also saying the same thing about Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom that would help boost support for Scottish independence and Brexit and all that kind of stuff. And it's the same kind of thing, just as your father would have joked. There's enough Scots who want to have an independent country that the issue doesn't go away, but not enough that they can very obviously win a referendum, which is you like, it's a great point. You want to have enough so that it happens and is it's a lot of people want it, so there's not as much turmoil afterwards. You don't want to win with 51 because that doesn't equate to a lot of stability afterwards. Although Newfoundland joined Confederation with I think 52%. So
was it so close in? Really? Huh? It was so close.
Yeah,
okay,
it was a 2-stage referendum. The first one was about whether they wanted to have independence, join Canada, or go back to being run by the British, which obviously was the least popular option. And then they took the top two and then went to either Confederation or independence. And it was pretty close.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks. I didn't know that. Oh, okay.
Okay, so I have one, and then we can finish with your Ontario one. So
okay.
I had this one from Marcus Meyer, and he just asked, the BC Conservatives, legitimate threat or just a flash in the pan for the by-elections?
Oh, the BC Liberals... They failed their branding, right? They have time to fix it, of course, but the election is fall of 24, I believe.
I think now it's It used to be in May, but I think now it's in October that the elections are in BC.
So they have 1 year to make British Columbians aware that BC United is the BC Liberals, because those by-elections in June, oh my goodness, those results were bad. And so the BC Conservatives, of course, have the advantage of the brand. The Conservative brand is strong in many places in the country, including in BC, and especially in the interior. But will British Columbians that don't follow politics as much as you and I even be aware that this new pink and teal party is the former Liberals? So I think it's more a question of whether the former Liberals, the Uniteds, as I call them, find a way. Les unitaires, oui, les unis. La Colombie-Britannique unie, CBU. Will they be able to make British Columbians aware that it's them? We'll see. But I would not be surprised if the BC Conservatives do a little better because of that.
Yeah, I think that they're a threat to the Uniteds, the BCUans. I think they are a threat in that sense, that you could see a lot of vote splitting in the next election. But it reminds me of the campaign back in, I think it was 2010 or 2013.
Right.
That the Conservatives had a former John Cummins, who was a former MP, who was the Conservative leader. He was in the debate. In some of the polls, he was doing pretty well. In the end, they ended up getting 4%, and the Liberals won a majority government in that election that we all have nightmares about as people who follow the polls. But I can imagine the same kind of thing happening. I don't think they would. I guess it's actually an open question whether they would get into the debate, because with John Roustad as the leader now, because he was a floor crosser from the Liberals, maybe they might invite him to the debate. By most standards elsewhere, that would not count, because usually you have to be elected under the banner. But if they get into the debate, if the Conservatives into the debate, then the Uniteds are going to be in trouble. But just looking at the polls as it is, even if they got all the BC Conservative vote right now, I think they'd probably still lose. So they got some work to do on their own.
Lose big. I mean, the NDP is in the high 40s right now. You won't beat the NDP if it's still in the high 40s. The NDP has to go down at some point. And the BC Greens, although they had decent results, the BC Greens are still in the mid-teens. So they're not a threat a year from now, a year from the election. Yeah.
Okay, you said Ontario. Let's go to Ontario.
Michael, simple question. OLP leadership predictions.
Um,
And I have to say, I followed, of course, the news. I followed the early race. Of course, we don't have the deadline. I think is in early September to join the race. I know Miss Crombie appears to have the name recognition, but we haven't had much numbers, and I have no idea how they will vote. But if you have a prediction right now, what would it be?
I think my prediction is that Bonnie Crombie has the name recognition and probably has the organization to sign up members and would still be the favorite. I understand that she might not be necessarily right in the sweet spot for the spectrum for Ontario Liberals, which seems to be a little bit more to the left right now. Yeah. I don't know in terms of the membership, but the thing is that with the other candidates, so the other candidate, Nate Erskine-Smith, who's a Liberal MP, Yasser Naqvi, another Liberal MP, Adil Shamji, an MPP, and Ted Shu, another MPP from Kingston. None of them are super well known, and so I can imagine them all kind of splitting that not Crombie vote. So it depends on who would end up going against her. But like I can imagine if Crombie is the front runner, and it's always difficult for front runners to gain support on these kinds of races. Yeah. But if she ends up, 40 plus, that's probably going to be enough. But again, like you said, I'm just pulling stuff out of, my backside here. I don't really have any idea how much support she has, how many members she's signing up. Once we start to get some of that information, the fundraising, we'll get a better idea. But for me, I just have to go with the name recognition and the probability of who has the strong organization.
It is a point system, isn't not? This time around with the Liberals,
like the Conservatives use.
Yeah. Right. Okay. That means that Miss Crombie cannot just tour the GTA and sign cards there. She has to tour Ontario. So it's the name recognition is on Miss Crombie's side. So by default, you would have to say she should be the favorite. But again, the point system, the ranked ballot, you never know what can happen. So again, Stéphane Dion won in a ranked ballot, and nobody thought he would win. So maybe this is the exception, not the rule. But we'll see.
And Dalton McGuinty, if I'm not mistaken, finished fourth or third when he won back in the 90s. He was not anybody's favorite. So again, that was a very different system. It was a delegated system. But you're right. There's Nate Erskine-Smith, for example, is recently up in Northern Ontario. That's the kind of game you got to play. Go to places where there aren't a lot of members, sign up 20, and suddenly you're getting 20, 30 points in the point system. So
I would say I would say to Michael, ask this question again maybe in November. I think the convention is early December, so we'll have numbers. I mean, we'll have numbers and data to analyze. Right now, it's too early, but it could be interesting. It could be very interesting.
Do you have any more? I'm out.
All right, I have this one from Sophie. I thought it was interesting because it's not necessarily just about politics and numbers. And Philippe Eric, what would you say has been your worst call or worst prediction that you have made in your career? And how did you justify or explain it? And so a humbling experience, it was written with respectfully and not as pointing arrows to us. But what would you say would have been your worst call? And how did you justify it?
How do I justify it? That's the interesting part. Okay, I would say there's two different ones.
Okay.
Because I've been doing this now for 15 years, so I've done a lot of elections. The 2013 BC election is the worst numerical one. There was every indication that the NDP was going to win.
Yeah.
The polls show they were going to win. My projections show they were going to win. I think that was the first one that I tried to do a probability, and I think I had 99 or something like that. So That would have been, yeah, that would have been the worst kind of call in terms of just the sheer kind of error of it. In terms of justification, I had no justification. The justification was that all the polls were showing it, and all the polls turned out to be wrong. There weren't any polls that showed the Liberals ahead, so there wasn't really a way to justify it. And the day after the election, I wrote a piece. It was a bit of a soul-searching piece on 308, the old site I ran, more or less saying like, what the hell am I doing, and what are we all going to do if we can't kind of predict, forecast elections if we can't rely on this? Like, it was more of I really need to go back and think about this, about the approach and what we're going to do. So that was probably the worst one. But in terms of
that's not your fault though. That's not your fault though.
No, that wasn't my fault. I guess I'd have to find one that was like literally my fault, but I'm without fault, so no.
Then let me answer this one then. While you think of one of your few.
Well, no, but the other one I wanted to say.
Oh, go
I said
ahead.
I had two.
Go ahead. Yeah,
the other one
go
was
ahead.
the 2016 U.S. presidential election.
Oh.
Because, like everybody else, looked at all the numbers, looked at how the states were going to line up, and said that Donald Trump's chance of winning was very, very low. I think I had put it around 13 or 15%, something like that. And that one was the one where I think we all kind of convinced ourselves that blue wall and that it would be too tough to flip that state and this state and this state and that state. But in retrospect, it was that he wasn't that far behind. And if he did make a gain, a lot of these states were going to flip. They acted together. It wasn't going to be that they were like 10 individual actors. So those would be the two calls. And again, in terms of justifying it, explaining it, it was, again, the polls were wrong or off enough. They weren't really that bad in that campaign, but they were just off enough. And also, I think it was the reinforcing things that, well, if this is like this, then that's going to be tougher, which means that'll be tougher, but it wasn't that way. So I think we all learned some lessons, and in 2020, we all did better in terms of putting things into context. So I think that's actually the biggest thing. If you learn from the mistakes and use it next time, then it's not all bad. All right. So what about for you?
And that blue wall in 16 all flipped back together in 2020, right? It was not individual. All of them, Michigan, Wisconsin, not all Ohio though, but yeah. All right, so I have two. One since I launched 338, and one was just before. You didn't know me. Okay, so the more recent one was the Nova Scotia election, which I should have pulled out of. My bad call was not to pull out. There was a Léger poll early in the campaign that showed the Liberals were cruising to victory, and the polls were in agreement with what we had seen pre-campaign. And then nothing for 3 weeks. And then the last weekend of the campaign, Main Street Research says, oh, it's a tie. So what do we do with that? Either the poll is wrong, or it means that the parties have really converged. And if there's last-minute movement or last-week movement, and you have one poll with 500 cases, that's not enough to have a projection. And so I just figured, well, I'm going to wait it out to see if somebody publishes on the Sunday, then on Sunday evening, and then nothing came out. And I left the projection there. And of course, it was garbage. It was garbage. Well, the thing is, I had 65% correct winners, but that's garbage. It's awful. It's you're supposed to be in the 90s. I should have just said, you know what? I do not have the data to have a projection and pull out, and I didn't. And I think that was a bad call. And the one before that, before I was in the media, I remember saying shortly after the 2011 election, wow, this was a realignment. The Liberals are done. It's going to be the NDP and the Conservatives like we have in most Western provinces. And so it turned out that, no, it was probably just a fluke election. So
you weren't the only one.
You weren't the only one.
There was a lot of people who, there was a book that was written, I think, by Peter C. Newman, more or less saying that, well, this is the end of the Liberal Party. Turns out, it was a fluke. It was an anomalous election.
That's true.
In a lot of ways. So, yeah. All right. So I don't have any more, so I don't know if you have any.
Nope, I'm all done. I thought that was interesting. Again, the humility in what we do, I think, is very important. And I thought it would be interesting to revisit those awful calls. So
Yeah. Well, eventually you make enough that they roll off your back. But
and you, Eric, have a great average. I've been following you for a long time. Your average is great, so no worries.
well, thank you very much. I try my best, and you also do a very nice job. And thanks to everybody who sent us some questions. It was fun. There's not a lot of big election news lately. There's going to be some by-elections coming up soon, federal and Ontario, and there's one in Nova Scotia coming. But yeah, it's pretty. We're just trying to enjoy the summer.
It's summer. Yeah, it's summer. People go outside. They try to enjoy the wildfire smoke. There you go.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's the bright side. Well, thanks so much, Philippe, and I hope the rest of your summer goes swimmingly.
Merci beaucoup, Eric. See you soon.